The theme for this panel today, what I've asked each of the speakers to speak about, is studying religion in the post-9/11 world. As many of you in the field are well aware, since 9/11, the tragic events that we all remember in our own ways, various ways today, both individually and as communities in communities of remembrance, you all know that the study of religion has suddenly become, dare one say, almost faddish across the academy, that religion is now deemed a proper object of study for economists, for political science. We know that there's a long history of cognitive science and religion, et cetera. In a sense, the study of religion has been busting out all over the university. And at the same time, I think that many of us, at least on the faculty here, have felt frustrated by the lack of any kind of real means of communicating across the disciplines. So what I've asked each of our speakers in turn to reflect about, both in terms of what they work on and personally based on their own experience, I've asked them each to reflect a bit with us on what they see the particular value of studying religion from specifically humanities or humanistic perspectives is in the very sort of complicated world that studying religion has become, much more diverse, much more complex than it was before 9/11. So I'd like to, first of all, thank each of our four panelists sitting down here in the front row for participating. It's a busy time of year for all of us. One in the front row is about to take his general exams, so I'm doubly thankful for him showing up prepared in a tie, no less.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Anne, for all that you're doing at the center, which is tremendously exciting, and thank you more immediately for inviting me to this, a tremendously exciting event, and of course, my deep thanks to all of you for coming. Let me begin with a seemingly bizarre set of observations. Let me take you back to ancient China and to an event, given the day that we're remembering here, a day of mourning. So imagine you were in ancient China and someone close to you passed away. Let's say your father, horribly enough. So imagine your father passed away. And for reasons that I'll be getting to momentarily, and part of the powerful but chilling aspects that I'll be talking about today, imagine that you're male. It's going to be very important. So you're male. Your father passes away. Part of what would happen, you could almost predict, because it's the sort of thing that you would think would happen. And it sure enough, happened then too. So what would happen is you would get obviously horribly sad. That doesn't surprise you. You also would get filled with, to use some of the terminology that I'll be building upon, I'll get later to where I'm getting this, you become kind of demonic, right? There's this horrible pain that comes from mourning when you lose someone close to you. It's the sense of incredible loss. There's the sense of incredible anger, even though you know that makes no sense. They didn't leave you because they wanted to leave you, and yet that is what we feel, and very strongly so. And so there's this anger at the departed, this horrible sadness, this feeling of incredible loss. Oftentimes that sort of demonic energy then gets directed at those close to us, even though it's obviously not their fault either, and it brings out some of our more dangerous sides as a human being. And imagine if that person, your father, what might be going on up there too. If all of these demonic energies are being unleashed here and now with us, imagine what it would be like for that person. The anger, the sense of loss, the seeing as the years go by, the family continuing without him, and even moving on with their lives without him. And imagine how demonic that anger would be. And the anger can grow, incredible resentment, jealousy, as people move on with their lives. And there too, it would bring out his worst sides, his most demonic sides, his most, use another term, ghastly or even ghostly sides. In fact, he would probably become a ghost, and a very, very dangerous one at that. So what do you do with all of this? Well, at the time, what you would do is clear. You would go through sets of steps to try to work through these various energies, including, most importantly, these demonic energies in yourself, in those around you, that you've in part unleashed upon them, that's brought out their worst sides perhaps too, and as in him as well. So, for example, you would do things like the following. You would physically put parts of his energies and parts of what were him as a human being in different places. You would put parts of it in a tomb. Of course, his body would go there, not surprisingly. You also would call his different souls in the plural, because we as human beings have lots of souls. We have different conflicting parts of our personality. And you call those souls, and you bring them to rest with the body in a tomb. And you put in the tomb things that he, as a human being, enjoyed in life and made him part of what he was, including foods he enjoyed, clothes he would wear, parts of what he was like as a person. If he was a judge, you would put things associated with his craft in the tomb too. And you would call it his new home. And you would say that. You'd actually make invocation saying, you're dead now. Understand you're dead, but this is your new home. And it will be a continuation of what you knew. I will then periodically come to you. And we will eat together. We will literally have feasts together. And we will have feasts together, drawing out our best sides of what we were like as human beings when, even if this was rare, when we were good to each other. And we will try to bring that back out again. And then there are other sides too, other energies. And those you physically put in a different place. Those energies involve things like our ability to think, to have consciousness, to affect things in the world. In fact, I can pick a pen up. It means that I have some kinds of energies that allow me to affect things. Those are called godly energies, the same stuff that exists up there with those gods. And they can also be quite demonic, in fact, frequently are, but they give you sort of power to do things. And those you remove from the tomb. You don't want those in the tomb. They would not be happy in a tomb, and they would not stay in a tomb. What you want, on the contrary, is for them to go up and float up into the heavens, and eventually, slowly, over the generations, join the other energies up there. But before they do, they're still going to hang around, and they will be demonic, and they will be ghostly, and meanwhile, we are too. And so what we do there is we all begin developing a different relationship. We call these creatures ancestors. And we develop a set of worship in which we worship them, or rather, and this is the more important term, relate to them as an ancestor, which they weren't when they were deceased. It's very different from what you're doing in the tomb. And so with these creatures, what we try to do is to say, literally, you invoke this, okay, now you are not my dad that I knew in life, you are now the first generation above me, and you are the descendant of the generation above that, and the descendant of the generation above that, and you should think of yourself as an ancestor within a clear patriarchal, a term I'll come back to momentarily, hierarchy, in which each side should help that below, and each side below should help that above in terms of feeding and maintaining the lineage, and that means we, the living, you should think of as your descendants. Not your children that you knew with all of our messiness in life, but as your descendants, who you will then support. And in each of these cases, the tomb that I mentioned, and now with these ancestral ones, you have certain rituals that you'll perform to try to inculcate these new roles that you're playing. So imagine, not only has your father passed away, and again, you're male, crucial here, imagine you also have a son. So one of the things you would do with this ancestor is you would go into ritual spaces and you would call down the deceased father into the ritual space, calling him to behave as an ancestor. You would relate to him, but not abstractly, because your son would play the role, the impersonator. Actually, literally, the word is the corpse of him. And so he would sit in the position that ought to be held by the hierarchically superior person in a patriarchal hierarchy. You, his son, but of course the father of your child, sits in the other position, and you relate to each other in a purely hierarchical relationship, the goal of which, with all of these three participants, is to inculcate through this reverse role-playing the proper sense of what it would mean to have that relationship. In other words, the ancestor now, the father, bringing in, learning how to properly play a patriarchal role to his son, me, and my son then trying to do the same thing by the fact that he now is playing the role of my father. And clear in this ritual, on the tomb too, but now very obviously, so I'll underline it, clear in this ritual is the fact that every single participant, most obviously myself and the son, know perfectly well that's not who they are. Not only are they not the father and son because you've reversed the roles, but they most certainly, even if they were that role, which they obviously aren't, they certainly don't really live up to that role, right? Like, if I had a son, I'm sure I would be a horrible father occasionally. We all would be. And the son would sort of, have temper tantrums and blah, blah, blah. And I probably had a complicated relationship with my father. That's usually the case. But in this ritual space of these role reversals, you're playing the perfect roles relating to each other perfectly in this patriarchal sense. Now, why do you do all of this? Because if you begin to do this, what you are doing is domesticating all of these incredibly dangerous demonic energies, putting them into different places, trying to build better relationships in these very different ways, all explicitly in ritual contexts that underline the fact that when you walk out of the ritual, it's going to be all messy again. And the demonic figure powers will come back. The ancestor will turn into a ghost again. Your angers and resentments and jealousies will come back again. And then you go back into the space and do it again. And it's an endless work of working through all of these complexities and messinesses of our desires and angers and jealousies, as well as our hopefully better sides, and trying to work on them. And of course, working on them with the next generation down. So slowly he, that son, would learn what it would mean to be a good son, and eventually what it would mean to be a good father, because he's already playing that role at this very young age. And through this endless work, you're trying to help all the participants, including the deceased, to work through this complexity through all of these endless new relationships created through these rituals. Now, the result of this would be what? Well, let's talk about it very straightforwardly, because this is crucial. All these terms I've been using come from texts from classical China. These are indigenous theories about rituals. The rituals were practiced, but I've been using the terminology of the indigenous theories themselves. And they're quite clear about why you do this. You begin the process that's a lifelong process and continuing thereafter of working through this complexity. That work is never complete, but even to the degree to which it is, you are trying to create, at least with the ancestral side, a perfect patriarchal, hierarchical world that you know doesn't really hold, you know perfectly well doesn't really hold, you don't even necessarily want it to hold, but to some remote degree you're trying to construct that. Now, why in the world have I taken you through all of this? I've done it for a specific set of reasons, both the powerful sides and the chilling sides. And let me now be explicit about the goal of this. As Anne mentioned, religion has become hot in all senses of the word. People are interested in religion, there's funding for religion, etc. But in a sense, we're getting the worst side of it, because what's getting funded are those visions that are kind of the, for lack of a better word, and I admit this is a very unfair way of putting it, but kind of the economic visions of ritual. So assuming human beings as rational choice individuals, and you're posing the question of, negatively put, why would someone buy into a traditional system? So why did they in the past, and why now do they continue to do so? And how do we break from that? Or if you don't want to put it negatively, and some scholars don't, you say, okay, but then granted this, why is it that these different memes of belief systems pervade, and perhaps they serve certain functions, and let's pose what those functions might be, and therefore not think of them as necessarily traditional, but think of them as some kind of functional working in the world that may have other equivalents in a modern society, but that's how we should think of them. But what happens with all of these is you take for granted a certain vision of humanity, a certain vision of the human condition, and, needless to say, a certain vision of what religions are. If, on the contrary, you take what I indeed would also call a humanistic perspective, what you're doing is not just going the reverse direction, you're posing new questions, because then you're looking at the work of religion. You're looking at what types of, in the strong plural, in any one area you're even looking at, visions of the human condition are endlessly being worked upon, how people work through the complexities of their lives, and what sorts of worlds they actively construct, because no one, not even in a traditional society, took for granted the world they lived in. This is all work. And, to give the example at hand, If you read just about anything written about Chinese religions or Chinese society, they'll say things like, well, back then they used to assume a certain worldview of organic harmony. They assumed a certain world of patriarchal lineages. Well, you can see immediately, no, they didn't think any of that. They were actively trying to construct that. And the power of working through that opens up tons of ways of thinking about the human condition. What does it mean to think of ourselves as having multiple souls, demonic energies, horrible relations with each other that we're endlessly trying to work upon? And the more chilling sides, I suspect, for everyone here, including myself, what does it mean if you're aiming at least pieces of that work toward creating a patriarchal order, where you're trying to literally cut out the female element because those become part of those energies that are literally taken out of the ritual process? What are the implications of that? And what do we as religion scholars do if some of this seems very powerful to us, some of it seems very, very chilling? How do we deal with that? What kind of normative criteria can we or should we legitimately bring to this material? How would this affect our visions of the human condition? And what happens when we bring in other ritual attempts to deal with the world, with also powerful elements and chilling elements, including all the incredibly powerful material that Kevin was bringing to our attention? How do we deal with all of this? I have absolutely no idea, but that is why I study religions. It's trying to work through this. To me, the study of religions is not unlike these as-if worlds that people were creating in these ritual contexts that we were just mentioning. You are trying to work through the implications of what it would mean to be a human being, which we are, with all of our complexities, and what it means if you work through it this way or work through it that way. And none of these ways of working really work fully. They're all potentially powerful. They're all potentially very dangerous. They historically have been very powerful and very dangerous. And the more we work through them, taking them self-consciously as incredibly powerful and chilling ways to work in the world, try to self-consciously remove from ourselves our easy frameworks, rational choice visions, tradition versus modernity, any of these simple ways of categorizing religion, and on the contrary, think of this as work, it opens up a lifetime of, indeed, working with this material, which I think is what we should all be doing. And that is why I study religions. It's why I teach religions. It's why I think we should all be trying to wrestle with these religious traditions from throughout the world, not because they're right, not because they're always good, they most definitely are not, but because people were wrestling with them for centuries, millennia, for reasons. And we can explore why, how, the implications, and we can wrestle too. That, to me, is a humanistic vision of what it means to study religions. You take them seriously, you think through the implications, you take seriously the horrors of many of the implications of doing so, and you try to work through the implications of that. There will be no easy answers. Even if you think you have something worked out, the demons return, they always do, and you have to work with them again. And when you think you've done something to get rid of the demons, you probably just created more and more powerful ones. That's usually the case too. And a life spent doing this is an incredibly, incredibly enriching and powerful life. Great, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks for inviting me to attempt to talk to the subject. A bit difficult after hearing Kevin and Michael, but I'm going to go ahead. As some of you know, I'm an ethnographer and have done extensive fieldwork in West Africa and Aboriginal Australia. In these remote societies, where I've lived and worked over many years, people do not identify any discrete existential domain that equates to our word religion. So when I came to HDS in 2005, I was seriously challenged by how I could engage with religious studies from standpoints that seemed quite foreign to the traditions that constituted the core curriculum here. Though I soon began to ask myself whether this apparent gap between the life worlds I had studied and the life worlds my colleagues studied was a product of our different methods rather than a reflection of the phenomena themselves. I certainly didn't want to fall back on the antiquated and Eurocentric view that societies like the Karanku of Sierra Leone and the Warlpiri of Central Australia were primitive, animist, or pantheist. For on the one hand, these pejorative terms completely fail to do justice to the complexity of these worldviews, and on the other hand, the terms could just as easily be applied to many aspects of life in Judeo-Christian, Buddhist, or Islamic societies. Was it possible, therefore, to identify any existential givens common to all human beings, despite the different ways they represented reality to themselves, or the academic conventions that chopped this reality up into discrete domains, the religious, the economic, the political, the psychological, the rational, the irrational, and so forth? I begin with an assumption that's been born of my ethnographic experience, namely that human beings everywhere are perplexed and provoked by the mystery of how the human relates to the extra-human, which is to say, everything that lies beyond our immediate comprehension and control. Experiences that we call religious are therefore connected with limits and limitations, with those critical junctures in life when we come up against the limits of what we can say or do and what we can think or know. In the book I wrote during my first 2 years at HDS, I borrowed Karl Jasper's concept of Grenzsituation, border situations, to theorize this penumbral zone between what is in the light and what lies in the shadows. I also took my cues from Wallace Stevens' compelling image in his late poem of mere being, where the palm at the end of the mind stands beyond thought on the edge of space, while a gold-feathered bird sings in the palm without human meaning, without human feeling, a foreign song, to capture something of the indeterminate and ambiguous realm between the hotel and the hymn, as Stevens has it, the human and the divine. During the period that I was working on this book, I would occasionally take a walk to stretch my legs and clear my head, often passing 95 Irving Street, where William James lived between 1889 and 1910 and wrote his most enduring work. There's a commemorative plaque on the stone gray picket fence, and the house, still a private home, has been well maintained. Sometimes my passing contact with this house brought to mind a passage in James' writing that resonated with my own work in progress and helped me clarify what I was struggling to say. One cold March morning, for instance, I was passing the house just as a City of Cambridge recycling collection truck was moving laboriously down the street, as if to remind me that I was simply putting back into circulation ideas that James had set down 100 years ago. Here's an example. Reality, life, experience, concreteness, immediacy, use what word you will, exceeds our logic, overflows and surrounds it. This from his lecture given in Oxford in the spring of 1908, where he added, "By reality, I mean where things happen." One can, I think, readily understand why James' notion of radical empiricism, with its emphasis on relations as well as relata, flights and perchings, rivers and embankments, verbs and substantives, conjunctions and disjunctions, proved so difficult to spell out and so irksome to many of his readers, for who in his right mind would identify reality with things that cannot be readily grasped or systematically named, with phenomena outside the reach of reason? Yet James insisted, our fields of experience have no more definite boundaries than have our fields of view. Both are fringed forever by a more that continuously develops and that continuously supersedes them as life proceeds. The relations, generally speaking, are as real as the terms are. Nor is it that the world that lies about us that is refractory to comprehension and control. It is also the world within. Again, James, whatever it may be on the farther side, the more with which in religious experience we feel ourselves connected is on the hither side, the subconscious continuation of our conscious life. There is probably no human being who has not been intrigued and troubled by the mysterious relationship between his or her own immediate world, a world of direct experience, and all that lies beyond it. It is never simply a matter of acknowledging or naming this extra-mundane dimension of our existence. It is more vitally a question of our relationship with it, how we reckon with it, draw on it, and control it. Of this liminal zone, John Dewey observed, "The visible is set in the invisible, and in the end, what is unseen decides what happens in the seen. The tangible rests precariously upon the untouched and ungrasped. The contrast and potential maladjustment of the immediate, the conspicuous and focal phase of things, with these indirect and hidden factors which determine the origin and career of what is present, are indestructible features of any and every experience." Although we often assume that reason enables us to grasp the unseen intellectually, if not actually, Dewey declares that this invocation of scientific rationality is as much a magical safeguard against the uncertain character of the world as the so-called mumbo-jumbo and superstition we attribute to pre-modern peoples. Dewey's remarks echo certain passages in William James' Varieties of Religious Experience, where he too speaks of the ways in which our private and mundane lives are embedded in wider fields of being from which we draw inspiration and vitality. Unfortunately, time doesn't permit me to go into a Karanko exposition of how this is theorized for them as a relationship between the town and the bush, between what is, as it were, the moral space of the community and the wild or antinomian space of the bush. But it bears an uncanny resemblance to Dewey's formulation, and this is something that I have been intrigued with for many years, that the thoughts that have been produced by Western philosophers are often directly comparable to the images that have been produced in the non-Western world, and often disparaged as an inadequate articulation of understanding. Which is exactly the point that Michael was just making about ritual theorization. Though there are countless ways in which any one of us construes and interacts with this non-immediate realm, James prefers to speak of it in fairly neutral terms as a wider self, or the more, or simply life, rather than as God. As such, it bears a family resemblance to what Freud called the over-I, Jaspers called the encompassing, and Heidegger called Dasein. As a pragmatist, James is less concerned with whether our language actually captures the essence of the elusive world that lies about us or inside us, since what is most crucial are the entailments of what we say and do for our own well-being and the well-being of others. Does God really exist, he asks? How does he exist? What is he? Are so many irrelevant questions. Not God, but life, more life, a larger, richer, more satisfying life is, in the last analysis, the end of religion. Basic to all these reflections is the view that one's well-being depends on one's relationships or connectedness to an elsewhere or otherness that lies beyond the horizons of one's own immediate life world. And that's the rationale for being an ethnographer. This other world is sometimes identified with the dead, and ritual labor enables the living to fuse their being with ancestral being in a life-giving union. Sometimes, as in traditional Christianity, it is a realm of divine power and presence associated with the empyrean. And of course, etymologically, the word for deity, deos, is from the root meaning the bright sky or daylight. Sometimes it is identified with the natural environment of the bush, as among the Karanko, or with the landscape itself, which is the case in Central Australia. Although, as Alfred Schutz observes, most philosophy and religion attempt to reduce the extra-mundane to a concept, to make it graspable and accessible to accustomed experience, to tame it, it remains at the limits of what can be thought or said, encompassing our relationships with ancestors, nature, God, foreigners, and even the unborn. And this is the limit at which I think ethnographers work, and as I've come to learn from being at the HDS, many scholars of religion work. So I've come to feel finally at home here. Thank you.
Do I need to press something to turn this on? No. Sorry. It's all on. Okay. Thanks so much, Anne, and thanks so much to the Center as well. It's an honor to present alongside such insightful scholars. 3 tough acts to follow. As Professor Monius mentioned at the start, the task of this evening's panel is to explore possible contributions of religious studies to understandings of contemporary global issues. As this is a rather roomy topic, I'd like to narrow my focus to a question. How might we study and understand mass movements of religious violence? To reflect on this question, I will examine 2 events or series of events of religious violence in the country of Myanmar, or Burma. The first is the Monastic Demonstrations of 2007, which have been popularly named the Saffron Revolution. The second is the recent string of Burmese Buddhist attacks on Muslims, which intensified earlier this year and continues into the present. Behind me are images from 2 American magazine covers that prominently feature these events, something to look at when you get bored. On the left is a photo of a few half-smiling unnamed Buddhist monks who appear to be chanting. This is from the 2007 September-October issue of The Economist. On the right is a less smiley Buddhist monk named Wirathu, or as the headline reads, The Face of Buddhist Terror. This photo is from Time magazine, dated July 1st, 2013. In the next 15 minutes, I'd like to present 2 juxtapositions. First, each event will be described in its plain and simple facts. This type of description resonates with representations of the events by the news media and a good number of social scientists. This fact-based description will be paired with accounts from persons who experienced or were implicated in the events. Secondly, I will juxtapose the 2 sets of events with each other. One where Buddhist monastics have been popularly portrayed as victims, and the other as aggressors, even terrorists. Overall, I aim to call attention to the complex relationship between violence and care, a relationship which I argue is effectively studied by the humanities and is important for understanding religious violence in Myanmar and possibly beyond. Now I'll begin with a bare facts account of the monastic demonstrations. On August 15th, 2007, the military government of Myanmar removed fuel subsidies, causing a dramatic spike in the price of diesel, petrol, and natural gas. This radical jump in inflation reverberated throughout the country's economy. Of greatest concern were skyrocketing prices of food, which had dire consequences for those living at the level of subsistence. Buddhist monastics responded to the crisis by congregating in public spaces and chanting loving kindness. To give you an idea of how this sounded, here is a translated segment of the chant. May all beings, all breathing things, all creatures, all personalities, all beings with mind and body, may all females, all males, all noble ones, all worldlings, all deities, all humans, all those in the 4 woeful planes, be free from enmity and dangers, be free from mental suffering, be free from physical suffering, and may they receive care happily. The military responded to these chanting monks by urging them to disband. After the monks refused to comply, soldiers broke up the crowds with force. One such breakup in the city of Bakoku resulted in injury of 3 monks. Demanding an apology, one group of chanting monks in that same city encircled and trapped a group of law enforcement officers. When news of the abuse of the monks in this bizarre capture spread, demonstrations swelled throughout the country, further filling public spaces and sacred sites. The monks were then joined by the laity. On September 27th, at the height of the demonstrations, the government opened fire on the crowds. After about 10 days of violent suppression, the demonstration subsided. Living in a monastery in central Myanmar throughout these events, I spoke regularly with monks and lay people about their own experiences. I'd like to share two brief conversations which I miraculously managed to document at the time. Both address one aspect of the theme of this brief presentation, the practice of care. The first conversation was between myself and a monk from a neighboring monastery. After I greeted him with "What's going on?" he responded, quote, "Today is another terrible day, Mr. Date. I heard on VOA that there are more shootings in Yangon. There are soldiers in the streets in our neighborhood. They have guns. I haven't heard of any gunshots, but still, this is really frightening," end quote. What to do, I replied, not quite knowing what to say. Then the monk sighed and explained, quote, "You must know something about our Buddhist religion, Mr. Date. Listen, the Blessed One, the Buddha, struggled for many lifetimes to help all sentient beings. You know, when the Buddha entered Nibbana, nirvana, we monks were charged with the responsibility of caring for, preserving the sasana. We have been trained to do this through our monastic discipline. Since then, the laity has helped us carry out this responsibility. They provide us with resources and protect us from the many dangers of the world. We're grateful for their help and their respect. But what's happening now? Violence against monks? Karmic retribution for injuring a monk is severe. If they want to support our care of the sasana, they should follow our lead. We want to show them, the government, that the people are suffering. Our lay supporters can't even afford to donate food to us. How can we care for the sasana if we can't eat? We're not angry. We're simply trying to show them our suffering, requesting support that only they can give. They should have addressed the fuel prices as soon as we began chanting. That was the root of the problem. We did not want to escalate the situation by surrounding that group of soldiers, but we had no choice because the sasana was threatened. To save the sasana, we had to capture those guys. It's a tragedy that we were disrespected in such a way. Our failure to care for the sasana is truly disheartening. Hey, go back to America. Tell George Bush to invade. If we can't get help from our lay supporters, maybe we can get help from yours." End quote. The second conversation took place between myself and a local horse cart driver. After getting into the horse cart for a ride to a nearby tea shop, I struck up a conversation with the driver, asking whether town was safe. After he indicated that he hadn't seen or heard of any problems, I asked if he thought whether that condition would change. He chuckled and answered, quote, "Hey, you've been talking too much to those monks. Listen, it's hard to believe that the government is attacking monks. I haven't ever seen that before. But you know, it's not necessarily a bad thing that the government is taking control. Let me explain. The most important part of our Buddhist religion is discipline. Through discipline, we can overcome ignorance and preserve the truth. After the Buddha passed away, it was decided that discipline would safeguard the sasana. Unfortunately, this discipline is impermanent. It was only a matter of time before corruption set in. To save the sasana, kings accepted the responsibility of detecting religious corruption and managing it. They took care of the sasana. Through the care of kings, has the sasana survived and prospered. These days, some monks were acting with purity of mind, but some were not. How do I know? Because of their comportment. Filling public places during hours of business is not proper monastic behavior. It's not a genuine expression of monastic discipline. It reflects an impure mind. The soldiers intervened just as they always have, to care for the sasana. Those monks tell you that this kind of treatment of monks is not really care of the sasana, but if the government did not intervene, the violation of monastic discipline would have been much more destructive to the sasana. It's like treating a disease. If you don't want to kill the infection, if you hesitate to cut it out, it might spread. The violence is unpleasant and painful, of course, but it's the right thing to do in the long run. You know, the sasana will certainly die out over time, just like all living things, but we have to diligently protect what we still have. It's precious. Without it, we'll lose our way." End quote. The monk and the horse cart driver seem to express contrasting views toward government intervention and monastic initiatives. There was much disagreement about who was in the right or in the wrong, who was the villain or the hero. Despite this essential difference, these conversations express a common concern for care of the sasana. A note on the word sasana: the term has a range of possible translations, including teaching, practice, doctrine, and even the Buddhist community. Because the word sasana can take on several or any of these meanings, I suggest that to think of it broadly as that which was received from the Buddha, something precious that must be respected and nurtured. That being said, the nature of the sasana and its care is deeply contested. According to the views expressed by the monk, care itself is generally unspecified and to be determined by the judgment of monastics. The laity has a role to play in the performance of care, but it is one of support, one that takes direction from the monkhood. In this event, care was recognition of the economic crisis, the consequences of which were directly threatening to the religious activities of monks and their supporters. Care was also asking someone stronger for help, i.e. the government, in carrying out an action that they themselves could do alone. The performance of care began in a rather innocuous manner, the chanting of loving kindness. It then became increasingly aggressive as the threat to the sasana grew. This act of care ultimately failed because the government not only rejected cooperation, but it also violated the integrity of the sasana through its physical abuse of monks. The horse cart driver also placed responsibility of sasana care in the hands of monastics. However, this care is to be monitored by the political authorities due to the inevitability of monastic corruption, especially when it comes to politically charged matters. In this case, caring for the sasana meant maintaining monastic comportment. Fearing that the corruption of this behavior would grow, the government was said to have intervened, cauterizing the infection before it spread. The performance of care was unambiguously violent and not without costs. Nevertheless, it was unmistakably, in the horse cart driver's words, an act of care. Now I'd like to shift our attention to the attacks conducted by Buddhists against Muslims in the country. First, the facts. Persecution of Muslims in Myanmar has occurred for at least a century with waxing and waning intensities. A recent upswing of these attacks began in March of this year. The first event occurred in the city of Metila. A Muslim gold shop owner and 2 employees allegedly assaulted 2 Buddhist customers in an argument over a golden hairpin. This dispute expanded rapidly, resulting in the deaths of approximately 40. As news of this event circulated, riots broke out in 3 other major towns, eventually displacing at least 9,000 people. These incidents of violence have closely paralleled the 969 movement. Its strongest advocate, Wirathu, the monk shown on the right side of the screen. Wirathu, oddly identifying himself as the Burmese bin Laden, has issued fervent warnings of the threat of Muslims in Myanmar. Quote, "If we are weak, our land will become Muslim," end quote. He has supported these claims with numerous examples of alleged Muslim terrorist acts in foreign countries, arguing that Myanmar will suffer a similar fate unless action is taken. Wirathu's 969 campaign, in his own words, promotes nonviolent suppression of Muslims through such measures as restrictions on marriages between Buddhists and Muslims and boycotts of Muslim-owned businesses. In comparison with the words of the monk and the horse cart driver, Wirathu seems to have taken a more militant tone, despite his claims to nonviolence. The weakness of Buddhists will increase the strength of Muslims. Muslims are on the cusp of conquering Buddhist lands and desecrating Buddhist sacred sites. Wirathu even names specific towns. I would like to suggest, however, that this language is not unconnected to the rhetoric of care of the sasana. Wirathu emphasizes that these measures are not intended to insult or destroy the Islamic religion, community, or culture. Rather, his efforts aim to protect and care for the sasana. In other words, instead of expressing a marginalized form of militant extremism, Wirathu's rhetoric of care appears to be consistent with the words of the monk and the horse cart driver. It's impossible to know whether Wirathu and others sincerely believe in the nonviolence that he advocates, whether he's genuinely caring for the sasana. However, it's evident that the mass appeal of this rhetoric of care has closely paralleled recent acts of violence. When questioned whether these practices of suppression compromise Buddhist values, such as tolerance and compassion, Wirathu retorts, quote, "You can be full of kindness and love, but you cannot sleep next to a mad dog," end quote. Wirathu recognizes the noble aversion for violence and the possible incompatibility between his message and other forms of Buddhist care. But Wirathu argues that such tactics are not appropriate for mad dogs. One monastic friend explained to me that likening Muslims to mad dogs is not simply dehumanized, but alludes to the common problem of rabies in Myanmar. Well-intentioned people, often children, want to help the infected animals, but are seriously injured regardless of their virtuous intentions. To truly care for these dogs and the community, you have to call the professionals. This reasoning of care resonates with many. There are voices who oppose Wirathu's views in the 969 movement, who promote values of tolerance and neighborly love with the Muslim community. However, these voices are clearly in the minority. I wager that the success of alternatives to Wirathu's message will likely depend on their cogency as a superior means of caring for the sasana. Generally speaking, reflections on the practice of violence in Myanmar take shape in this rhetoric of caring for the sasana. The relationship between caregiving and violence is a contested one. The people of Myanmar are actively asking, are violence and care mutually exclusive or possibly overlapping? Can violence ever be felt as genuine care? If there is an overlap between care and violence, are there limits? Where? At what point does violence fail to be care? It seems to me that patterns of religious conflict in the country will be guided by the ways in which arguments are marshaled to answer these questions. In conclusion, I want to briefly return to the task of this panel, consideration of possible contributions of scholarly work in the humanities to contemporary global issues. To understand these recent events of violence in Myanmar, I suggest that we turn not just to the bare facts, but to stories about how these events were experienced by those who lived them. Furthermore, I take seriously the use of language in these narratives and call attention to the importance of the rhetoric of care, particularly care of the sasana. I believe that study of expressions of care of the sasana can help us achieve not only a more sophisticated, but also a more complete understanding of these events in Myanmar and how violence has been working there. But before I'll end, I guess I'd like to add one last point. This presentation has been focused on the case of Myanmar, but to what extent is this contested relationship between care and violence limited to this country or merely Buddhist communities? Might we see debates about care and violence being played out in other places or even here? For example, might we view current debates about responding to Syria as another conversation about the relationship between care and violence? Perhaps this exercise of returning to ourselves is another important benefit of humanities-based approaches, the study of contemporary global issues. Thank you.